have connections, live connections to Istanbul, to some of the organizers who are actually actively leading a campaign against violence against women in Turkey right now. So the organizing committee members will connect with them, and we will have a little brief chat with them live.
Herkese merhaba demek istiyorum. Öncelikle burada size seslenirken bu kadar mesafe olarak burada ama aynı amaç için bir araya geldiğimiz için bir arada olduğumuz Kanada'da o salondaki arkadaşlarıma seslenirken tüm dünyaya sesleniyor gibi hissediyor ve çok büyük heyecan duyuyorum.
Hello everyone, I'm gonna translate this to the best of my abilities. Okay, so please bear with me. So our friends in Istanbul are welcoming everyone, and they're extremely pleased to see that we have all united here for this good cause.
Gerçekten 8 Mart Dünya Kadınlar Günü'nün özüne yakışır bir biçimde dünya çapında birleştik diye düşünüp çok büyük moral duyuyoruz.
International Women's Day is a global event, so here we are united, not only here but also in Istanbul. So we are definitely giving, we are doing justice to the day as it is, yeah.
Bu morale ihtiyacımız var.
Okay, sorry about that. Devam edebiliriz.
Evet, bu morale çok ihtiyacımız da var. Çünkü Türkiye'de kadın haklarından ve Kadınlar Günü'nden söz ettiğimizde kadınların hala önlenebilir sebeplerle öldürüldüğü Türkiye'de kadın cinayetlerinin devam ettiği günler yaşıyoruz.
When we talk about violence against women and murder of women in Turkey, unfortunately, we are talking about events that are very well, that could be very well avoided in advance if appropriate measures would have been taken.
Ne yazık ki biz 8 Mart'ları son 4-5 senedir kadın cinayetlerini durduracağız diyerek bu sloganla ve öldürülen kadın kardeşlerimize hitap ederek anıyoruz, kutlama yapıyor, yürüyüş yapıyor, protestolar yapıyoruz.
Sadly, for the last 4 and 5 years, when we celebrate International Women's Day, we mostly talk about the murder of women and putting a stop to the murder of women, instead of celebrating all the other things that we could be celebrating about the Women's Day.
Türkiye daha Orta Doğu'ya yakın olmaktan ya da İslam ülkesi olmaktan dolayı değil, aslında modernleşme sürecinde ileriye gittiği için ve kadınlar haklarını daha fazla aramaya başladıkları için Türkiye'de kadınlar öldürülüyor. Artık kadınlar modern haklarına daha fazla sahip çıkıyorlar. Buna erkek egemenliği direniyor ve şiddetle, cinayetlerle son bulabiliyor.
We do not really believe that these murders are happening in Turkey because Turkey is a Muslim country and it's in the Middle East. It's more about that Turkish woman and the country in general is really on the way to be more modernized, and everyone, especially women, are seeking out and claiming their rights. So this struggle and the realities of a male-dominated society, they create the structures that lead to these kind of murders.
Türkiye'de kadınlar daha fazla haklarını aradıkları olumlu anlamda oy verme hakkına eskiden beri sahip olduğumuz ülkede hayatlarını seçme, hayatlarını belirleme hakkına da sahip olmak istedikleri için öldürülüyorlar. Bu açıdan burada muhafazakar bir hükümetin olması, kadınların eşitliği için, kadınların güçlendirilmesi için güçlü bir siyaset yapman hükümet yerine bunun tersine bir siyaset olması böyle bir kriz yaratıyor. Türkiye'de kadınların hakları kazanmasına direnen erkek egemenliğini hükümet besliyor, bu direnci kırmıyor. Bu yüzden kadınlar diğer ülkelere göre daha fazla öldürülür hale geldi ülkemizde.
Women in Turkey have been able to vote for a very long time, but these days, the problems we face are more about the conservative nature of our government. Instead of helping women to claim their rights and their rightful place, which is an equal place in society, the current conservative government has unfortunately been fueling these kind of negative, male-dominated, backward-thinking behaviors.
Biz bu çelişkiyi, bu gerilimi görerek sırf kadın cinayetlerinin durdurulması, bunun önüne geçilmesi amacıyla bir büyük platform kurduk. 4 senedir bu platformla beraber kadınların hayatta kalması, korunma haklarının, korunma kanununun uygulanması için, onları hayatta tutmak için mücadele yürütüyoruz. Ve aynı zamanda ne yazık ki korunmayıp öldürülmüş, kaybettiğimiz kadınlar için de davalarına sahip çıkıp Türkiye'nin çok sayıda ilinde, adliyelerde avukatlarımızla dava takipleri yapıyor ve adalet sağlansın istiyoruz.
Since 2010, our platform has been focused on helping women and supporting them in claiming their rights. And a part of this work has been focused on making sure that the law to protect women is being implemented properly, and also following various cases and providing women with legal support as well.
Bunu yaparken hem erkek egemenliğine karşı hem de bunu destekleyen, cesaret veren hükümet politikalarına karşı mücadele yürütmemiz gerekiyor.
While we do this, we are not only trying to push against the conservative narratives, conservative legal actions taken by the government, but we are also trying to influence the society and the mentality that creates the space for these kind of actions to take place.
Bu gerçek şöyle, bunun orada Kanada'da bizi salonda dinleyenlerin için anlaşılır olmasını istiyorum. Okay. Örneğin 3 gün önce üniversite öğrencisi gencecik bir büyük şehirde, İstanbul'da gündüz otobüsün içerisinde üniversite öğrencisi genç bir kadın öldürüldü 7 Mart'ta. 8 Mart'ta 2 çocuk annesi bir başka kadın kardeşimiz öldürüldü. Her gün böyle haberler alıyoruz.
We really want to make sure that our friends in this room really understand the reality of Turkey. Just on the 7th of March, so just the day before the International Women's Day, a very young woman who was barely 21 got murdered in a public bus in Istanbul, in this big city in Istanbul. This 21-year-old woman was murdered by her ex-boyfriend. And I'll just add a little bit to this information, that young woman had sought police protection twice. She had already visited appropriate authorities twice, but was not provided the appropriate protection. Devam edelim.
Binlerce kadın bu tehdidi görüyor, şiddet tehdidinin altındayken korunma için başvuruyor. Binlerce kadın korunma yasasından yararlanmak için başvuru yapıyor ve yüzlerce kadın, yani geçtiğimiz sene 2013 yılında sadece bize ulaşan 237 tane kadın kardeşimiz öldürüldü.
Thousands of women are in a similar situation. They seek protection. They go to the appropriate authorities. But unfortunately, while thousands ask for support and help, hundreds get murdered. Just in last year, 237 women were murdered in Turkey because of these reasons. It's not an accident. It's you see it coming. Son bir iki cümleyle bitirelim mi? Çok teşekkürler.
Biz bu acı durumu ortadan kaldırmak, kadınların güven içerisinde yaşamasını sağlanmak için başta yaşam hakkı ihlali olan kadın cinayetlerine, onun dışında her tür hak ihlali, haklarımızla da ilgili her tür saldırıya karşı hükümetin de gündeme getirdiği kürtajlar, gebelikte, kadınlardan sadece 10 ve çocuk istenmesi siyasetine karşı mücadele yürütüyoruz.
We are fighting not only to put an end to these incredibly ridiculous murders, but we are also trying to help further the women's rights agenda in Turkey. So that includes abortion and all other legal rights that go along with it. Son cümle.
Kazanacağımıza inanıyoruz. Çünkü bugün buradaki büyük mitingde meydanları doldurduk. Çok sayıda ilden, her yerden gelen hem ailelerimizle hem platform üyelerimizle çok büyük, güçlü bir yürüyüş yaptık. Bu yürüyüşün moral kuvvetiyle de oradaki bütün salondaki herkese selamlar, sevgiler gönderiyor. Kolay gelsin diyoruz.
Even though we are faced with very hard and harsh realities, we are certain that we are going to achieve all that we want to achieve, and we will further women's rights agenda in Turkey. Just yesterday in Turkey, for the March 8th International Women's Day rallies, we filled up squares full of people to fight for that cause. And today we are here together, united again for this cause. So we believe, let's end on a happy note, we believe that we are going to achieve what we are after. And on that note, I'll leave the room for our dear professors. Thank you for coming.
Younger sisters fighting for their rights, and I like to. My name is Mustafa Koç. I'm going to be chairing this event today, so I'll be very brief. I like to mention we have a wonderful group of panelists. They will each be speaking around 10 to 15 minutes. I will try to encourage them to be as brief as possible. We have one global commentary from Puna Katuria at the end of their address, and then if we will still have some time, we will be talking about. We will be taking your questions. Some of the speakers were mentioning about this 21-year-old young woman who was killed in a municipal bus in Istanbul. This is, if we can put a picture to the name, this person can no longer be an anonymous person. Özge Gündoğan was one of the women who were killed in recent years in Turkey. According to the Ministry of Justice announcement in 2010, there was an increase about 1,400% in women homicides at that time in the last 7 years. The police reported last year 61 women were killed by their husbands or lovers, but unofficial count by the web portal Bayanet put the death toll at 214. Bayanet reported 23 women were killed in incidents of domestic violence last month alone, and website said 853 women have been killed in Turkey since the start of the decade. So we really want to address this problem, and we want to share it with the members of our community in Turkey, in Canada, and we'd like to share this with everybody. We all know that violence against women is a universal problem, and no society, no culture, no community is immune to this. So we just wanted to use this platform provided to us by Science for Peace to focus on Turkey today. And our speakers are experts, they are professors in social sciences, and they like to share some of their observations with you. And as our friends from Istanbul mentioned, that there was a very successful, very impressive demonstration in Istanbul. Thousands of women came out to express their outrage, what we are fighting is an attitude, is a mindset, is a culture of patriarchy. It was that is reflected in a daily newspaper today, and it was in Sabah, and it basically, I'm just translating it, this guy is sitting on a chair, and while his wife is serving, bringing him some cup of coffee, and he's complaining that she had such an attitude the day before. He was saying, what was that yesterday that you were acting? And this is the attitude we really like to challenge. And I hope our wonderful panelists will address these issues in more detail. So we will begin with a more general presentation by Sedef Arat-Koç, and I will be reading their biographies rather briefly because because of time shortage. Sedef is an associate professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration and a member of the School of Graduate Studies at Ryerson University. And her research focuses on women in Canadian immigration policies and practices and Turkish society and politics in a period of neoliberalism and post-Cold War geopolitics. She's presently working on the impacts of neo-Ottomanism in Turkish foreign and national policies. Please, sir.
Thank you, Mustafa. It's a great honor to be given this opportunity to speak here on such an important day, such an important topic to talk about. And I think that the young women who connected to us from Istanbul already started providing some of the analysis as to how to make sense of violence against women. But I'll try to use some of my professional expertise to add some of their points. I will be speaking more generally about how to understand and how to address violence against women. Female homicide, kadın cinayetleri, is only the tip of the iceberg of a much larger, more serious problem of violence against women. And violence against women itself is also the tip of the iceberg of a larger set of problems that are the result of patriarchal power relations, ataerkil ilişkiler. Violence against women is not simply a problem of the pathological, personal, psychological makeup of individual males, but it is rather a problem of patriarchy. Patriarchy has been defined by many different scholars as a social, economic, political, and cultural system of male and masculine control and power, and a system of female subordination that corresponds to this power. To talk about and understand violence against women in Turkey, there are a few important general facts to consider, and some of these have already been mentioned. First, it is important to remember that violence against women is not unique to Turkey, but that it is a universal reality in the contemporary world, that it exists in all cultures and societies, East and West. Of course, in talking about this topic in Canada, we need to remember a most striking and most visible example of murders of women, which is the Montreal Massacre in 1989, when 14 women were killed and several were wounded by a male gunman who expressed his anger and resentment to women as being the source of his problems in life. Second point to remember, second very general point to remember, is that violence against women not only exists across cultures and societies, but that it exists across social class, rural, urban areas, regions, and so on. And that it is not only confined, as the young women and who connected to us Istanbul expressed, it cannot just be confined to what are considered to be traditional sectors of society, but that it is also very common in some modern structures and relationships. A third important point to remember is that patriarchal power, which is the source of violence against women, is not confined to individual male-female relations. It's not just confined to family life or to individual communities, but that it is often created or strengthened through a number of different structures and institutions which may variously contribute to marginalization, devaluing, dehumanization, and social exclusion of women. And among these structures and institutions, we need to count the economy, the state, legal structures and state policies, the educational system, religion, the media, and so on. Patriarchal power is strong and deep-seated precisely because it is rooted in or supported by several of these institutions simultaneously. Structural factors and various social, economic, political institutions are important, not just in determining whether men are likely to commit violence against women, but they are also very important in determining whether women are locked into these relationships or whether they may be able to escape these relationships. I will give you a few examples of how some of these structures and institutions work, and I will elaborate on this by giving some examples in relation to Turkey. When we talk about the economy, for example, one of the most recent concerns, and a very legitimate one in Turkey, is the concern that women in Turkey presently are represented in rather low percentages in the labor market. This is a very important point to address, but I would also say that we need to go beyond that question of whether or not women are being represented in the labor market and ask some more general questions. We need to recognize that when women are in the labor force, they are generally in the informal sector, in the underground economy, and their labor is generally devalued and their working conditions are generally very negative. So participation in the labor force also, we cannot assume, necessarily automatically leads to empowerment of women. When the women's labor in general is very highly devalued, and when women, even when they work for a wage or salary, they find that their labor is still devalued. We need to remember the history of International Women's Day when we consider questions of economy as factors that may lead to empowerment or disempowerment of women. We need to remember that the International Women's Day commemoration and celebrations came out of a 1911 fire in a factory, in a garment factory in New York City, which led to the deaths of 148 women. The fire started as an accident, but the deaths of women in this case cannot be blamed on an accident of a fire, as the doors and exits to the outside were all locked by the employers in the fear that these women would either steal the garments or that they would take very frequent breaks from their work. This fire, which was a very tragic event, an event where women were literally jumping to their deaths from 7th, 8th floors of a building, led to a good cause in the sense that it speeded up some labor action to improve working conditions of men and women in the United States. When I talk about the media as another important institution, another space where women may receive not such good treatment, we need to realize that it is not just some of the traditional roles that women are presented in the media that is the source of the problem, but we also need to recognize that some of the sexualized images of women, reducing women to just being sexual objects, dehumanizing them, also leads to certain kinds of problems. There are also huge problems in the Turkish media as to how violence against women is often depicted. In October 2011, for example, Habertürk, a Turkish newspaper, published a large photograph in color on its front page, showing a woman stabbed by her husband with the knife literally on her back, bleeding to death. We need to ask questions when we see such images as to what the purpose of these kinds of representation are. Whether we need to ask the question of whether these images are helping sensitize the public to the seriousness of violence against women, or whether they represent another form of pornography, what we may call a pornography of death, which may desensitize the public to the deaths of these women, on the one hand, and may actually lead to scaring and intimidating other women from leaving their violent partners who may be contemplating that they may face a similar end to their lives. The state is also a very major actor. The state can play roles to either help reduce or prevent violence against women, or it may play a role in actually enabling or justifying violence against women. Some of my colleagues here will be discussing how the state may do these things through legal mechanisms and certain kinds of policies. To this, however, I would like to add something that's rather sober and hard to talk about. And that is the fact that, unfortunately, in Turkey, as in some other places in the world, the state also has been an actor sometimes in itself being an active agent of violence against women. During military regimes in the 1970s and 1980s, as well as in recent decades, there have been widely cited cases of violence by state security forces against women in state custody in the form of rape, sexual torture, sexual humiliation, and sexual insults, as well as routine uses of virginity tests as forms of humiliation and punishment against women. As importantly as these forms of violence, they have been supported by certain actors in the Turkish media. When Eren Keskin, for example, a lawyer and human rights activist, has publicly alleged sexual abuse of Kurdish women detainees by Turkish soldiers, the response to her allegations have been to first try and convict her for insulting the Turkish army, and secondly, it has taken the shape of threats of sexual assault by some prominent Turkish journalists. A very infamous case of such assault, threat of assault, has been by Fatih Altaylı, who has spoken on radio, in public record, that he would himself be the first one to assault Keskin himself, because she seemed to be asking for sexual assault by her allegations. It's very painful to talk about how deep and how wide violence against women runs in many different societies, including the Turkish society. As painful as it is, though, I think that to be able to address it means that the struggles against violence against women also need to be multidimensional and multi-level. We need to understand that legal measures and dimensions would be a very necessary part of the solutions, but they would by no means be sufficient. We need to realize that wider economic political changes need to be present to address the social economic inequalities, and we also need to recognize that there needs to be movements towards deeper and more meaningful democratization on the one hand, and peace in Turkish society on the other hand, to be able to address all of these problems. I just want to end by highlighting the meaning and significance of a very important and powerful symbol that's used in North America mostly, or that originated from North America, but that is widely used in many different countries in the world today. And that is the symbol of bread and roses, which has become a very significant symbol for International Women's Day and for women's rights struggles around the world. The bread in Bread and Roses is generally about economic security, and it just highlights the fact that women, as well as all human beings, first need to be able to eat and have decent working conditions to feed themselves. The symbol of the rose, however, is much more open-ended, and it is open to your interpretation as to what it really means, or what it could mean. I would suggest that we can perhaps interpret the rose to refer to a better world where there would be more equality in the economy, society, and the state, where all human beings, including all women, enjoy basic security and dignity. In addition, the rose could come to represent a general democratization of life in all different institutions and structures in Turkish society and elsewhere. And finally, and importantly, I would also argue that the rose could come to represent a politics of peace, where we demand a peaceful political climate, where political differences are not addressed through violence, repression, or war, but through peaceful ways. Thank you.
Our next speaker is İdil Atak. İdil is an assistant professor at Ryerson University's Department of Criminology. She is a research associate at Hans and Tamar Oppenheimer Chair in Public International Law at McGill University, and a regular researcher at Chaire de Recherche en Immigration, Ethnicité et Citoyenneté at UQAM. İdil served as a legal expert for the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ankara, then as deputy to the permanent representative of Turkey to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg.
So I will adopt a legal perspective in order to explore a bit domestic violence in Turkey. As it has already been mentioned, legal inequality, gender inequality, constitutes a key problem in Turkey's development agenda. Combating violence against women, including honor killings, remains a major challenge for Turkey. This has been recently underlined by the European Union Commission on its progress report on Turkey. So you have a few statistics on the screen. 42% of women over age 15 and 47% of rural women have experienced physical or sexual violence at the hands of the husband or partner, widespread problem in Turkey. So I propose this outline. First of all, I will briefly talk about progress in the fight against domestic violence, and when I talk about progress, when I say progress, I mean legal progress. What have been these legal changes adopted by Turkey during recent years? And secondly, I will underline the gaps in the law and enforcement failures, and I will specifically refer to a judgment by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. First of all, progress in the fight against domestic violence. There have been lots of things that have been done in terms of legal developments in Turkey to protect women against domestic violence. In 1998, a law on the protection of the family was adopted, and this law offers several mechanisms to protect against domestic violence. It also established a protection order system. For example, a person abused by a family member under the same roof can apply for an order from a family court, and orders can, among other things, require the offender to leave the home, stay away from the victim and their children. So it's an important development in terms of protection of women against domestic violence. Other developments include penal and civil codes changes in 2004 and 2005 to increase sentences for honor killers. Another law was adopted very recently, 2 years ago, on the protection of family and prevention of violence against women. And a national action plan to combat violence against women, 4-year national action plan, is implemented by the Ministry for Family and Social Policies. We also have a specialized domestic violence police unit being set up very recently. Members of the judiciary and law enforcement officers underwent awareness raising and training sessions on these whole new legislations. Violence prevention centers were established in 12 pilot cities throughout Turkey. Shelters for women who are victims of domestic violence were also established in more than 60 big cities in Turkey. On paper at least, when you look at these recent legislative developments, we can say that the government has a good record of fighting the problem. But this is my second point. There are gaps in the law. This is the first thing. And then there are enforcement failures. This has already been mentioned. And as I said, I will refer specifically to this European Court of Human Rights judgment, which dates back to 2009, the Opus against Turkey. I selected this judgment. There are other judgments concerning domestic violence, honor killings, by the European Court of Strasbourg, but also by other supranational mechanisms such as the UN committees. I selected this one because it shows very well what are the gaps in the implementation of this new legislation, but it also illustrates the attitude by the police and law enforcement officials and also by our judges. So let's start by the facts. What are the facts in the case of Opus versus Turkey? The applicant, Mrs. Opus, complains that her husband had violent and threatening behavior since their divorce. There have been numerous incidents of violence, including several beatings, a fight during which the ex-husband stabbed Mrs. Opus 7 times, so serious injuries inflicted by the ex-husband to Mrs. Opus. The applicant's mother had become a target of the violence because she was trying to protect her daughter. During an incident, the ex-husband ran the 2 women down with his car. The Turkish authorities had been alerted about the violent and abusive behavior of the ex-husband, and Mrs. Opus repeatedly requested protection. Each time, the authorities, the police and judges, took down the man's statements and then released him, referring to the need to refrain from interfering in what they perceived to be a family matter. There were no criminal proceedings against the ex-husband, even after the stabbing. Finally, the 2 women decided to move to another city. They were living in Diyarbakir, and they decided to move on to another city. They were traveling in the removal van when the ex-husband forced the van to pull over, opened the passenger door, and shot Mrs. Opuz's mother, who died instantly. The man, ex-husband, was charged with first-degree murder, and he said, as you can see on the screen here, that he killed the applicant's mother because his honor had been at stake, as she had taken his wife and children away from him and had led his life into an immoral way of life. The investigation into killings has lasted for more than 6 years, and the ex-husband was released pending the appeal proceedings. So Mrs. Opuz took her case before the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, alleging that the trial was ineffective. So we have a look at the judgment by the European Court, which is extremely rich and interesting, and you can you can read this judgment online. I will focus on 3 points in this judgment, which show that the problem of domestic violence is widespread, and also the gap between the legislation and its implementation. My first point concerned the right to life of the mother and the right to personal integrity of Mrs. Opuz. The court said that the police, prosecutors, and judges in this case failed to protect these rights, right to life of the mother, and also the right to personal integrity. The judicial decisions had no preventive or deterrent effect on ex-husband, according to Strasbourg court. They had been ineffective and even disclosed a certain degree of tolerance towards his acts. Notably, after the car incident, the ex-husband had spent just 25 days in prison and only received a fine for the serious injuries he had inflicted on the applicant's mother. The court also underlined that after stabbing Mrs. Opuz 7 times, the ex-husband was imposed with a small fine, which could be paid in installments. The investigation into killing, having lasted for more than 6 years, according to the court, European Court, these investigations cannot be considered as effective. So the court underlined the fact that Turkish authorities had not shown due diligence in preventing violence against the applicant and her mother, in particular by pursuing criminal and other appropriate preventive measures against the ex-husband. Domestic violence was tolerated by the authorities, and that domestic remedies indicated by the government in this case didn't function effectively. This is the first point that I would like to highlight. My second point concerns the right to equal protection of the law. The court considered that Mrs. Opuz be considered to fall within the group of vulnerable individuals entitled to state protection. I think this is a very interesting point that the court underlines. And the court Strasbourg court refers to 2 things. First of all, the individual situation of Mrs. Opuz and her mother. The violence suffered by the applicant in the past, the fear of further violence, and the second thing that the court has underlined in determining that Mrs. Opuz was a vulnerable individual entitled to state protection was the social background, namely the vulnerable situation of women in Southeast Turkey, as it has been already mentioned by Sev'er. In this regard, the European Court, noted that the highest number of reported victims of domestic violence was in Diyarbakir, where the applicant had lived. All those victims were women, the great majority of whom were of Kurdish origin, illiterate or of a low level of education, and generally without an independent source of income. What the court says is the following: social inequality, gender, ethnicity, and economic marginalization are all factors of invulnerability, and state authorities in this case should take positive steps to address this situation. And in Mrs. Opuz's case, this was not the case, apparently. Then the state's failure, according to the Strasbourg court, to protect women against domestic violence breaches their right to equal protection of the law. My last point, and my third point, the Strasbourg court found that Mrs. Opus had been discriminated. When victims reported domestic violence to police stations, the court underlined the fact that police officers do not investigate their complaints, but seek to assume the role of mediator by trying to convince the victims to return home and drop their complaint. Another point highlighted by the Strasbourg court is that the police officers consider the problem as a family matter with which they cannot interfere. Courts are not implementing the law either. There are unreasonable delays in issuing injunctions to protect women suffering from domestic violence because the courts treat them not as an urgent action. Delays are also frequent when it comes to serving injunctions on the aggressors, on law enforcement side as well. The perpetrators of domestic violence do not seem to receive displays of punishments because the courts mitigate sentences on the grounds of custom, tradition, and honor. Many women, particularly in rural areas, are unable to make formal complaints because of their cultural, economic, social marginalization, because leaving their neighborhoods subjects them to intense scrutiny, criticism, and in some cases, violence. So the court finds that Mrs. Opus is discriminated by the Turkish authorities, and the violence is a gender-based violence. And this domestic violence is tolerated by Turkish authorities. Yeah. The court underlined the general passivity of the judicial system and impunity enjoyed by aggressors. By which Turkey created a climate conducive to more domestic violence against women. So to conclude, I don't have a slide on conclusion, but domestic violence is a major human rights problem. It involves the right to life, the right to safety, the right to dignity of women, but also the right to effective remedy, the right to not to be discriminated based on gender. Victims of domestic violence are vulnerable groups for various reasons, as it has been underlined by Strasbourg Court. This vulnerability should be taken into consideration by state authorities. They have to take concrete positive action to address the problem. And currently, unfortunately, this is not the case. And the court also underlines this fact. The problem is not the legislation per se, but rather the general attitude of the local authorities, the unresponsiveness of the judicial system, and impunity of the aggressor, which only marginalizes further women. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Edith. Our next speaker is Dilan Batki. Dilan was born in Diyarbakır herself, and she moved to Toronto at a young age. She graduated from University of Toronto studying international relations and political science, and she's currently an MA student in the political economy program at Harvard University. She moved to Turkey in 2011. She has been active in civil society organizations, and she is part of Toronto Kurdish Women's Committee.
I would like to thank organizers for this panel on a very important subject and for inviting me today. As Mustafa mentioned, I was born in Diyarbakır and I came to Toronto at the age of 10. Throughout my time in Canada, I have visited Turkey numerous times, and in 2011 I decided to live in Turkey for a year in order to get a great feeling of the country of my birth. During this time, I conducted interviews with women rights organizations such as Kardelen and Kamer, which is focused in Turkey's southwestern Kurdish region. Growing up in Diyarbakır during the 90s, was always surrounded by strong women. Women who found themselves in the midst of ongoing conflict, and within the conflict, acted as anchors of stability within their communities. This is not to downplay their plight, for all women in Turkish society are treated as a second-class citizen. And for these Kurdish women, the discrimination was twofold. I mean, in the regions that you face discrimination twice, being a woman and being a Kurd. When I returned to Turkey in 2011, I experienced a different side of the country and came to face with a problem plaguing both Turkish and Kurdish societies. During my stay, I interviewed many women who had become victims of domestic abuse. Women who were marginalized by society, women who had nowhere to turn except for the organization I shadowed. During my third month interviewing battered women, I met a lady beaten by her husband almost every day. She had no one to go to. Her family was a great distance from Diyarbakir. Despite her battered state, she did not want anyone to know, and instead sought to contact authorities as to her plight. The police sent her home to her husband, where the beatings continued. She eventually ended up in the hospital in an attempt to speak to the police officers for the third time. The officers were unsympathetic and again provided little help. When I met her again, she stated that police had told her, "Are we supposed to deal with you all the time? Do you think we don't have anything else to do other than dealing with you and your husband's violence?" They said she was being embarrassment to her family. She went home again to her husband, but this time he had found out about the fact that she had been to the police station. The beating got worse, so worse that the near end of my trip, I heard that the lady from Diyarbakir, the same lady who I have interviewed, asked the police multiple times to interject and detain her husband on domestic abuse charges, had escaped the constant fear and bludgeoning. The only way she could do that by taking her own life. So she committed suicide. In Turkey and the country's Kurdish region, domestic violence survivors face significant barriers to getting help. In such situations, family members of husbands often control the woman to such an extent that she is physically, psychologically, and economically incapable of seeking any help. In addition, women also lack of confidence in their police services and government representatives. Given the way that they are treated, as my story has shown, even if authorities will help these women, years of conflict in the Turkey's Kurdish region has contributed a fundamental mistrust of both state and police. Practical barriers such as lack of Kurdish to Turkish translators and limited opening hours for family courts have also limited the methods of recourse for Kurdish women. Given the traditionalism still pervasive in society, police officers are more focused on family unity instead of protecting a woman or pushing them to reconcile with abusers instead of pursuing criminal charges or getting women out of abusive homes. While law enforcement training and public pressure has led to some progress, much still needs to be done before women can be protected from domestic abuse. According to Human Rights Association in Diyarbakir, by November 2013, 28 women died as a result of domestic violence within their home. 11 were injured, one was reportedly harassed, and in public space, 12 women were killed and 12 were injured, and one was raped and 4 was harassed. And the final act of violence for some women suffering from domestic abuse was also self-inflicted. 25 women committed suicide by November 2013, and 10 additional attempted suicide. 2013 was not a watershed year. Between 2002 and 2009, a significant number of women have been murdered. In 2002, 66 women were been murdered nationwide, but by 2009, 953 women been murdered. So from 66 to 953. Why are these numbers dramatically increased? Why should 5 women on average be murdered each and every day across the country? Your ethnicity does not play a role when you're facing a violence as a woman. The same story goes between Western Turkey and also the Eastern Turkey, the Kurdish region. There are numerous factors at play, but I would like to focus on the sexist and male-dominated discourse of Turkish and Kurdish society. A milieu in which family honor, the issue of shame and taboo, has taken precedence of the individual and collective rights of women in the country, where the police officers and state institutions offer almost no help. A culture which has excused and underplayed the problem of domestic violence and femicide, while the problem gets worse. The pervasive attitude of society can also be seen clearly in how media report domestic violence. Turkish news reports daily on the murders of multiple women, many times by their family, in a cold and monotone manner, as one would think, as if they're talking about the weather, because they have made it sound and look like that it's normal to do so. Showing a footage of a woman being beaten up by her husband and no one around her reacts to the situation, it gives a message that it's okay to do it, because no one is here to judge or truly prosecute, because system fails when it comes to domestic violence. One of the most publicized cases in Turkey was Güldunya Tören, whose death sentence was passed after banishment from her village as a result of her refusal to become the second wife of a rapist. The man who met her pregnant. Turkish authorities failed to protect her, and her brother shot her dead in her hospital bed, where she lay from the first attempt on her life. Turkish and Kurdish women should not be viewed as a weak of their victimhood. Both have contributed greatly to their societies and cultures to remain pillars of their societies, though it is time for their societies to recognize their pivotal place at the center of their family and community life. This is especially true for Kurdish women, many of which the younger generation have taken up themselves to join politics, participating in a political decision-making mechanism. So the Kurdish women movement have empowered the women in the region, including Gülten Kışanak, who is a co-chair of Turkey Peace and Democracy Party. So there's been a huge shift in terms of politicizing the woman, and of course that's also due to a conflict. Even the women, mothers and grandmothers who have organized peaceful protests, the young women who have established and run the NGOs. I have visited women who dared to go to police when battered. They have all shown their political power, their willingness to change Turkish society for better. It is now on Turkish society to repay them for their service and ensure that old, more traditional relationship between men and women are left in the past, and equal rights and cultural which respects the rights of every individual, no matter her gender, race, or religion is respected. And I want to leave with one of my favorite quotes in Kurdish. Jin means woman, Jian means life. So the word life comes from woman. So the quote means woman, life, and freedom, meaning Jin, Jian, Nazali. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilan. We will memorize that slogan. Our last speaker is Aysan Sev'er. Aysan Sev'er is Professor Emeritus of Sociology, University of Toronto. She is actually coming here after I should mention this as a little note before I read the rest of her biography. She's coming after a serious surgery, so she we are grateful that she's here with us, and she may have still some problems with her voice, so, but we are grateful that she's here. She's the recipient of numerous national and international awards for her work on violence against women. Her most current research focuses on extreme forms of violence against women. She has a long biography, but she has been whispering me not to go through the whole thing. But she's the author of several books and close to 100 articles. So we welcome Aysan Sev'er.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you to Science for Peace for helping us organize this particular event. And I would like to also thank my much younger colleagues for putting their time and their energy and their hearts into the issue that I have been struggling to come to grips with for the last 30 years of my life, of my academic life. Mustafa already mentioned my özür, my voice, so please do bear with me. I did have a throat surgery just a short time ago. I would like to start by saying that we did talk about the New York fires in 1911, which were really fundamentally linked to the publicizing of the Women's Day related issues. Just to add to what Sedef said before, don't forget that in just last year, there was a similar fire in the garment factories in Dhaka, Bangladesh, which killed 117 women garment workers. So as we are celebrating this international, very important event, we have to also take into consideration that some things, unfortunately, are not changing. Maybe we are shifting them from one part of the world to another. I would like to start from the assumption that violence against women is very, very gendered, and it is not random, and it is not because of crazy people doing crazy things. There's a systematic nature to it, which has been emphasized by all of my colleagues before, and I would like to re-emphasize, it is a gendered type of violence. Moreover, I would like to, as the last speaker, trying to make sense out of so many things that can be said about this issue, I would like to emphasize the divisiveness of the violence against women issue. It divides men against women, it divides ethnic groups against ethnic groups, religious groups against other religious groups, developed societies against developing ones, older people against younger ones, pro-feminist men and women against traditionalists, women's activists against cultural relativists, and it even divides academics. I have had more arguments about violence against women with my colleagues, sometimes both male and women, than anybody else in my life. There are attitudinal problems and there are hypersensitivities that have been discussed today by my younger colleagues and emphasized, and rightly so, in different ways. There are problems with building bridges across religious and ethnic divisions on violence issues. There are problems with building bridges across pro-feminist men and feminist activist women. Building bridges across academics and non-academics have always been very problematic. Problems with overcoming stereotypes and prejudices between in-groups and out-groups are very systematically problematic. And sometimes these in and out groups are self-defined, sometimes they are culturally defined. But whatever the case is, these problems that I'm emphasizing also add to the problem of addressing violence against women as an integral issue which challenges each one's human rights. There are also research problems I would like to just touch upon briefly. There are problems of definitions. What do we call violence? Do we call it domestic violence? I'm personally against that conceptualization because there is nothing domestic about violence. It is violence against women. Do we, for example, look at different forms of violence and then combine them all against violence against women terminology? Or do we look at femicide, feticide, dating violence, dowry murders, or honor killings, which many people do not like to utilize the terminology? I call them patriarchal murders. Problems with measurement. How do we measure them? Do we count slaps? Do we count hits? Do we count how many teeth a woman lost? What do we do in terms of control and power? How do we measure psychological issues of violations of women, which are sometimes just as severe as physical forms of violence? Problems with reporting. Women underreport violence. Men overreport violence. They say, she threw like a drop of water at me or something like that, so I'm just not as much abused. I'm kind of course, exaggerating it, but there have been studies which are showing these patterns, and they are really systematically true. Police also underrepresent violence within family types of situations. They overrepresent stranger-to-stranger violence, but they underrepresent intimate forms of violence. Problems with law and law enforcement, which I don't want to go into anymore because it was very succinct in terms of drawing their attention to those problems. Now, just recently there was a survey, national survey done by some news media in Turkey, and they asked the efficacy of laws that pertain to violence against women. And people know that our laws are not working. Sometimes we have faulty laws which are being implemented and changed and adjusted as we go along. But the efficacy, the working of the legal mechanism is not working, and people know it. 96% of the respondents said that it is not effectual. There are, of course, international bodies which look at violence against women, and I will just mention CEDAW, which is in 1979, and DVOG, which is Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women in 1993. And Turkey is signatory to both of these international laws. This was a campaign that was carried out in 1995 by Amnesty International's Turkish branch, and they tried very hard to make an issue about violence against women. And indeed, in 2005, some laws were changed, especially that pertain to the mandatory punishments of honor-related crimes. And but as we can see, even since then, the numbers are on the rise. Sedef mentioned, what do the media want in terms of showing women who have been murdered, their pictures. Murder of women is not pretty. And just talking about it sometimes, I believe, does not do justice to those women. They have died. They have died horrendous deaths at the hands of people whom they considered to be the closest to them, especially in honor-related crimes that I call patriarchal murders. These are communal crimes. They are communal crimes. People sit down and make a decision about who's going to kill the woman at what time, with what weapon, and what they are going to do with the body. These are communal crimes. We have to face the ugliness of these crimes in order to have the passion to combat them. Women are disposable. Their bodies, after they are killed, are all over the place. Our friend Özge, not Özge, sorry, Dilan, talked about Güldünya, who was killed in Istanbul, and she was under supposedly police protection when she was killed. But her killers, who were her brothers, had traveled, hunted her down, and killed her at her hospital bed. These are almost inhuman forms of crimes against women. Yes, they are in the continuum of violence against women. But as I said, these are almost crimes that have a communal nature to them. There are so many of them. Thank you, Mustafa. There are so many of them. As you can see, they are young, mostly. That doesn't mean men don't kill older women. All women are under threat. But mostly, these crimes are against young women because men want to send a message to all women to be afraid of them and not to challenge the patriarchal order. Over here, again, another one, which really, I studied this particular case for a long time. This man, I don't want to call him gentleman under any circumstance, takes his little girl to the hospital bed to kill his wife and then leaves alone, leaving the little girl with her mother. This is a person, Şemse, who was murdered by, again, her kin. What I want to do right now is emphasize the multiplicity of factors behind these extremely violent crimes. There are socioeconomic factors, there are demographic factors, there are cultural divisions, as earlier discussed. There are cultural traditions, which I want to emphasize myself. There are traditions of honor, which is really a misinterpretation of honor, which is at certain times a bastardization of honor. There are preoccupations with the honor system. In the Turkish language, in some of my publications, I counted close to 100 words that relate one way or another to honor. There are preoccupations with virginity. Again, not to take away from the structural factors, but there are cultural factors which are also compounding the problem. There are preoccupations with virginity in the Turkish society and in some other very patriarchal societies. There are hundreds of words that reflect, the preoccupation of the society with these aspects which pertain to women's bodies. There are expectations from young men to establish their masculinity through showing extreme forms of violence against women. There are public voyeurisms, public peeping Tomish, voyeurisms about violence, about notions of virginity, for example, which are linked later on with violations of women. Red belts signify virginity, and red-belted women, whether they are modern or traditional, are generally perceived as almost transactions between men. The men almost use women's virginity as something like an exchange item. And I'm going faster because 1 minute. How about if I have another one because I had an operation? Why not? This, joking to aside, this particular woman was killed the morning after her marriage because her brother tied the red belt and her husband claimed she was not a virgin. I'm going to skip some of the things I wanted to tell you, but the second classedness of women follow them even after death. Women who are killed in relation to so-called honored crimes or warped understandings of honor are not even buried by men. They are left in hospitals or wherever they are killed. They are not buried by men, which is an expectation in the Islamic cultures, at least in most cultures. So women bury them. And men usually go and blacken their tombstones. Their secondary classedness follows them to the grave, which is a crime in itself. We talked about the law in terms of, the state failures, which are many. I am going to go to the very last 2 of my slides, where I try to combine for you the negative factors, which are historical, current realities, patriarchal systems. As you can see, it is the longest. It is the longest on the table, and gendered differentiations. These are all feeding into buttressing a system where men systematically hurt, maim, and kill women. On the positive side, there are social, cultural, state level, and international efforts that we can engage in order to combat all of these forms of violence against women. What I would like to end with is by saying that divide and conquer has been used in patriarchal societies a lot. I invite pro-feminist men, I invite activist academic women, I invite feminist women, I invite every human being who has any kind of respect for human rights to combine their passion, their work, their energy to erasing all violence against women in every shape and form without fueling divisions which have unfortunately helped to prolong them. Thank you very much for
Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and I totally feel honored to be here. I'm actually here to listen. So I won't talk much. I think this has been a great privilege listening to you all. And I could have actually closed my eyes and I could have been in India. And I think that is that's my first comment. I think there is no such thing as patriarchal societies. The entire world is patriarchal. I don't think there's any, and then you might have very small communities which are not so patriarchal. So I think this is a call for all the women in the entire world to come together. I think it's not for a particular society or particular societies. I do think that Turkey has some very, very strong laws and a very, very dynamic women's movement. And what is good and what I could hear from you all is that the conversation has begun, the challenges have begun, and the contestations have begun. I think that is the most important vibrant message that I was getting from you all. And I feel you women and us women can only go forward from here. But our hope does lie in the young people who are very bravely coming forward. And I could see those two young women who were speaking to us from Turkey, that there is protest, that there is resistance. Conservatism has been rising all over the world. But there is hope in resistance in the sense of, let me just think. I was very quickly trying to think, and you have Masouda in Pakistan. You have Jyoti Pandey. There was a rape murder which happened in Delhi on 12th of December, on 16th December 2012, which led to a huge protest and a change in the rape law. You have that in India. You have what you mentioned, a woman killed on 7th March and people came out in huge protests. And I think just the other day I was listening on the radio in Canada that there was an incident in a university campus in Ottawa. And suddenly the rape culture term was being used in a Canadian context, and I was saying, okay, this is all coming together and we are now being able to see across our cultures. And I do want to say that all these are the tipping point for change. But the change is obviously the result of a very strong, vibrant women's movement which has been there for years. I mean, we just can't say that, oh, this was the moment of awakening. I think there has been groundwork, there has been hard work, and sustained work by the women's movement, and that this is the outcome. I just want to say that by labeling some countries as violent, dangerous, rape capitals, applied selectively by the mainstream media, are we being manipulated? What they actually end up doing, the media successfully does, is shift attention from the possibility of feminist men and women being able to come together, organize themselves against sexism and misogyny, and which is actually experienced across culture, across the world. I just have very quickly some data. 26% men in South Africa, Africa, said they have raped. A woman is raped in India every 20 minutes. Read South Asia. 1 in 5 women in USA. So I'm saying, isn't this an across the world statistics? So why are we getting into seeing that, oh, it's not happening here and it's not happening here? So I'm just saying that because by othering of cultures and issues, we actually foreground differences rather than commonalities, and that prevents our integration as people who believe in women's equality, men and women who are feminists. And I would like to just end with that, and I would like to say that we should all just come together, and it's time we all said that we will not live with this anymore. And bring together. So this is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, speaker. But I apologize. My English is not very well. I just try to say I'm Iranian. I understood whatever you say because the culture is very similar. And my question is about Seda and you, Saiwan. Yes, right? Yeah. And my question is, what is your alternative for the woman? Because the violence is not cultural, actually, not for Turkey only, not for Iran, only for universal. Yeah. My question is, what is your alternative for the woman for freedom?
Okay, and I will take two more questions, or we will take all those three. Okay.
Thank you. I will just, I have a story actually, because my grandfather, especially after...
Be very brief though.
Sure, yeah, it's a very brief one. My grandfather is originally from Urfa, Şanlıurfa, and his younger brother is still living in the region. What happened is a Shiite clan member wanted to marry his younger daughter, and at the end, because he was against marriage, and they had to leave the city entirely. And my question is the authorities is basically they are just lack of confidence, and they are not actually enough to protect the woman or any of these just issues across the country. And why is it all the eastern regions of the rapes and the forced marriages, and why it is just this high, and why is basically it's just getting higher and higher in number after 2005? Because I am from the region as well, and then so because we talked about why this is happening, but we don't know the answer for the future. What can be done? And why basically is that some part of families, they even have to leave their hometown because of the scared of the Asherites or clans. That was my question. Thank you.
Ana dilimle konuşmak istiyorum, hem dil bariyeri yüzünden. Öncelikle şunu söylemek istiyorum. Platform hep beraber bizi bir araya getirdiği için kendi adıma teşekkür ediyorum. Çok önemli bir konuda ve çok önemli bir zamanda yan yana geldik. Kadın cinayetlerinin maalesef sürekli artış gösterdiği bir dönemde. Ben bütün hocalarıma, bütün konuşmacılara şunu sormak istiyorum. Sağ olsun özellikle hepsi belirtmeye çalıştılar ama bütün dünyada kadın cinayetlerinin artmasının ortak sebepleri her yerde benzer özellikler gösteriyor. Hindistan'dan konuşan arkadaşımız da belirttiği gibi, hocalarımızın belirttiği gibi. Ama bölgemizde bunun çok daha, ülkemizde ve bölgemizde bunun çok daha yakınlığı hızlandırılmış vaziyette son 10 yıldır, 20 yıldır, 30 yıldır, 35 yıldır yaşayan bir gerçekliğin insanlarıyız. Türkiye'li insanlarıyız. Türk ve Kürt insanlarıyız, Ermeni insanlarıyız. Ben hocalarıma şunu sormak istiyorum. Devletin bireysel erkek şiddetinin, deli, eğitimsiz, kültürsüz erkek şiddetinin kadın cinayetine sebep olduğu gibi sistematik olarak devletin savaş eliyle, savaşın üzerinden yürüttüğü, savaşın aslen kadınla başlayan, kadını öldürmekle başlayan kısmının gittikçe yoğunlaştırılmış vaziyette daha da yakınlaştığını düşünüp korkuyorum. Ülkemizden ve bölgemizden korkuyorum. Biz acaba cinayetleri durdurmak için, kadın cinayetlerini durdurmak için bu konunun artık daha da bilince çıkartılarak devletin sistematik olarak yaptığı savaşın durdurulmasıyla beraber bu cinayetleri durdurabileceğimizi vurgulasak iyi olmaz mı? Teşekkür ederim.
I will just briefly summarize the question for our audience. Our dear friend Sema was drawing attention to the fact that even though globally the rate of the murder of women has been increasing everywhere, in Turkey in particular, this rate has been increasing a lot faster, the murder of women. And she's specifically asking about, on one hand, yes, we have the domestic violence, the intimate murders, the murders that happen on a personal basis, but there are also structural forces that we are referring to here. There's an ongoing war, etc. So she's specifically asking not only about the domestic aspect, but also about the systematic murder of women in Turkey. Yeah. Dördüncü soruyu alalım mı?
Onu da alalım.
Okay.
It will be very short, I promise. It's about CEDAW. The next reporting period is coming up in July 2014. If we look at the previous reports of CEDAW, the Turkey is reporting everything so nice, and we may think that the problem is solved in Turkey. So what can we do as social activists or NGOs? What can we do to interpret this report? What can we do? CEDAW. CEDAW is a Convention of Discrimination, Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, right? Yes.
Let me try to respond to the CEDAW question first. Yes, Turkey has been filing the reports and trying to make the reports look a little bit pink roses than the actual situations, unfortunately. But Turkey has also failed repeatedly to fill the CEDAW reports on time for numerous terms and got actually some kind of a negative reaction from the United Nations for it. What can we do? We are doing it. This is the way to say that what is being reflected in a pink roses form is not necessarily reflective of some of the realities against, especially in terms of violence against women in Turkey, and individuals and individual organizations such as Kamer from Diyarbakır and Batman areas and so on have the absolute right to challenge and to report, to file in their own reports to these United Nations types of organizations. So I would encourage, individual NGOs, local NGOs, and women's activists and academics, whoever they are, to actually challenge. But of course, it comes down to getting data in order to challenge these things. So that's one way I would say. In terms of protection and failing, protection of women and failing, yes, there are systematic errors. In Turkey, to my knowledge, even though I was never a law professor and I did not teach or study law, but to my knowledge, Turkey is still asking women to actually file their complaints, which is really saying that the women don't do it because you're going to get hurt even more. So that has to be changed. Canada changed this. Canada changed this, and with quite a visible level of success. When you leave the reportation to the women, they won't report it. They are afraid of repercussions, they are afraid of being beaten, their families to be injured, their children to be taken away from them. At worst, they are afraid of being killed. If you make the law and put the burden on the women to follow up with the legal systems what is happening to her, I think it is a very, very wrong start to begin with. Maybe some of these activists can actually demand that other people can also lay charges, and those charges would not be dependent on the how can I say, women, the abused or the hurt women herself to be claiming the abuse. I'll leave the other two to my other colleagues. I think they are in a better position to answer those. I just wanted to pick on those two questions.
Thank you very much, Dilan.
I want to say something about the conflict within the region. You're absolutely right. It's very systematic. For example, if a woman is being abused by her husband or father or brother, and she doesn't trust to go to the police station, then she wants to go to one of those NGOs, Kamer or Kardelen, or a political activist. But the problem is, all those political activists are in prison in Diyarbakir. You know, the only fault that they have is because they're trying to help these women who are being abused by their husband, by the male dominant, and they're in prison. So this is systematic. I mean, it's not just, it's part of the conflict because, I mean, through my observation, I think Kurdish women are much more politicalized than a Turkish woman. And that's just because they had to. I mean, during the 90s, their husbands were taken, their sons were taken, their brothers were taken, so they had no choice but also to be responsible for their household and also go look after their loved ones. So it is systematic, and what could be done? I mean, this is about being united, you know, leaving your differences behind and being united as a woman, and hearing their voice and shouting for them.
I would say the same thing. Legal action, take legal action. I think it's not immediate, it's not a magic solution, but we are, in principle, a state governed by the rule of law, respectful of human rights. We have a constitution which recognizes these basic human rights, fundamental rights and freedoms. We are also part of the European Human Rights Protection System, European Convention of Human Rights, as I mentioned, and also the UN protection system. We have international obligations as well, in addition to our domestic obligations with regard to the respect of human rights. So yeah, the legal action and taking cases before the domestic courts and then going to the UN committee, CEDAW, is an option, but the European Court of Human Rights is another option, is a very powerful option. Not immediate action, but some of the recent laws and regulations adopted, for example, in 2012, were adopted as a result of the European Court of Human Rights judgments. So I think legal action is important, and we have developing civil society, we have NGOs, human rights activists. So to conclude, as a positive manner, we have now more and more the means of taking legal action and changing things.
My colleagues have already addressed some of these very important questions in very effective, important ways, but I would like to add to some of the points. I think that in terms of solutions, we may need to think about short-term solutions versus long-term solutions, and some of the structural changes that I recommended, some of them may need to be thought in the long term. In the short term, because the violence that's being faced by women, as Aysan Sev'er very effectively put it, is a form of communal violence. It's not just individual violence. The responses to this violence may also need to be in the form of communal defense of women who are facing these conditions. Families, communities, and the society and the state actually embracing the women and trying to find ways to protect them against the violence. So it has to be at several different levels. The families, instead of confronting the women, need to embrace the women, but also their communities, which may be sometimes in the form of, I mean, if it can't be the whole community, it can be in the form of women's groups, organizations, and so on, trying to provide protections for these women, as well as larger societal kinds of measures and state legal measures and so on to address the problem. In the long term, though, as I was trying to talk about it at the end of my presentation, I just want to say that because the issue is so multidimensional, multi-level, because it's so deep and wide at the same time, we need to think about what I would call a politics of equality, a politics of democratization, deepening and widening democratic relationships in all spheres of life, from the family to relations between the state and people and so on, as well as a politics of peace, are absolutely needed, because general violence in societies, a general tendency to address differences, political differences between us through violent means, and a general militarization of societies, which we see not just in Turkey, in the Middle Eastern region, but also in many different parts of the world. These are huge problems, and they so much ease violence against women, as well as violence against all people. So I just want to say that we have to fight in all these fronts. And I just want to add with some citing an interesting debate that took place, not a debate, but some exchange in literature between Michael Ignatieff, who was the leader of the Liberal Party, but also before that, he was and after that, for that matter, he has been a professor of human rights on the one hand, and Wendy Brown, who is a political philosopher, a feminist political philosopher on the other hand. Michael Ignatieff said that all human rights activism could ask for is basically to stop killings, to stop torture, to stop beatings of people, and so on. This is not just a strategic minimalism, but this was all we could ask for. And to him, Wendy Brown responded by saying, human rights politics would be extremely limited if all we asked for is to stop violence. She suggested that we actually have to have a politics of justice that has to go beyond, well beyond, just stopping torture and violence. We need to ask for a politics that does other things so that there won't be any breeding ground for violence in the first place. And I just want to repeat again my point, which is perhaps an interpretation and elaboration of Wendy Brown's point, which is that we do need a politics of equality, a politics of democratization, and a politics of peace to address it as a problem, to address violence against women as a problem at its very roots. Thank you.